Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who are joining us on our heritage.org website. For those in-house, we would ask that courtesy to see that our mobile devices have been silenced before we begin. And of course, those watching online are welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. We will then, of course, post the program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. Leading our discussion is James Roberts. Mr. Roberts is our Research Fellow for Economic Freedom and Growth in the Center for International Trade and Economics. His primary focus is to edit the Rule of Law and Monetary Freedom sections of Heritage's annual Index of Economic Freedom. He also studies economic and political issues in Latin America and Europe, as well as development assistance and nation-building issues. Before joining us here, he served in the State Department for 25 years. He also helped coordinate several major U.S. assistance programs, including efforts to reform Eastern Europe and to reconstruct Iraq. Before entering public service, Mr. Roberts was a financial analyst at the Ford Motor Company. He also served in the U.S. Navy Reserve from 1982 to 93. Please join me in welcoming Jim Roberts. Jim?
Thanks very much, John, and welcome. On behalf of my Heritage colleague and co-author, Brett Schaefer, who I know is here somewhere, we're delighted that you could join us today for a discussion of ideas to overhaul America's foreign assistance programs. U.S. foreign and security challenges are vastly different now than they were after World War II. The broad goals have been to assist people in crisis, enhance market opportunities for American products and investments, catalyze economic growth in developing countries, and promote U.S. national security and foreign policy by supporting allies and countering adversaries. These are all worthy goals. But like any policy, the need is for an update. Now, we need a periodic update, and we're long past having had one. Reevaluation, reorientation of concepts, elimination of duplication and waste, of which there is much, addressing changing circumstances, the fact that official development assistance from the Western powers and Japan used to be the primary source of investment for developing countries, but is now dwarfed by private capital flows. And this change needs to be reflected in our development assistance programs. Fundamental reform has languished for a long time, and as a result, many programs they're no longer fit for purpose. Today, the U.S. government funds programs created by dozens of large and small federal departments and agencies, more than 30 at last count, that have proliferated over the decades in response to the latest crisis and then never seem to go away. The combined effect is that U.S. foreign aid has become diffused, scattered unevenly, thinly, in an attempt to achieve an increased number of disparate goals with an unwieldy number of countries. And as a result, its foreign aid has been micromanaged and has lost coherence, flexibility, and vision. Fortunately, President Trump's USAID administrator, Ambassador Mark Green, has pledged to make the hard decisions to reshape USAID in particular and American foreign aid in general. As Ambassador Green has said, aid should be aimed at building institutions that are effective, accountable, and ultimately replace aid. In other words, he wants to put USAID and the foreign aid programs of the United States out of business by having successful development strategies. And in that spirit, the Trump administration ordered a review and a redesign of foreign affairs and foreign assistance programs more than a year ago. To date, we haven't seen this comprehensive redesign rolled out publicly, although there have been some efforts to internally reorganize USAID. And the head of OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, has proposed almost doubling the size of that agency with a new name, something along the lines of a development finance institution or development finance corporation, which we've written about at Heritage. That's being the vehicle for that in Congress is the BUILD Act of 2018. So as you saw when you came in, Brett Schaefer and I authored a major paper last year where we outlined many recommendations to reform foreign assistance, including significantly restructuring USAID, expanding the role potentially of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and reforms to eliminate duplicative work at state and AID in areas such as food aid and refugees. With that paper as a backdrop, we're joined today for a discussion on that topic by three eminent experts in development policy. I'm going to introduce all of them, and then we're going to take them in turn, and they're going to make presentations, and then we're going to have a time for questions. So first is William Easterly, professor of economics at New York University and co-director of the NYU Development Research Institute. Dr. Easterly earned his PhD in economics at MIT. He is a prolific author of more than 60 peer-reviewed articles, which are frequently cited in the literature. Professor Easterly has written columns and reviews for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the New York Review of Books, and the Washington Post. He's also the author of 3 books, the most recent of which I have here, The Tyranny of Experts, Economists, Dictators, and the Forgotten Rights of the Poor, March 2014. He also wrote The White Man's Burden, Why the West's Efforts to aid the rest have done so much ill and so little good. And he wrote, which won the F.A. Hayek Award from the Manhattan Institute. And he wrote The Elusive Quest for Growth, Economists' Adventures and Misadventures in the Tropics. Our second speaker, we're delighted to have the Honorable Paul Applegarth. Mr. Applegarth is an honors graduate of Yale and earned both an MBA with high distinction and a JD from Harvard. Throughout his distinguished career in the U.S. government, the World Bank, and the private sector, Mr. Applegarth concentrated on development and continues to do so. And in light of that background, President George W. Bush appointed Paul to be the first CEO of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Prior to that, Mr. Applegarth was managing director of Emerging Markets Partnership, an asset management firm that specialized in international private equity and debt investments in emerging markets. He was also chief operating officer of the Emerging Africa Infrastructure Fund, an innovative private-public partnership sector initiative sponsored by the British and European governments, which combined public sector money and private sector funds and investment skills to develop infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa. Earlier, Paul worked in various Wall Street firms on other innovative equity and debt transactions. And finally, and certainly not least, we have the Honorable Jose Cardenas, who's currently with the consulting firm Vision Americas. And he has nearly 3 decades of experience in Washington in the political process, especially in inter-American relations. Jose has held senior positions at the State Department, the National Security Council, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, where he was the acting assistant administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean. He received a master's from Georgetown and a bachelor's from Catholic, and has written and spoken widely on hemispheric issues. And Jose is a strong advocate of open political and economic systems, including free trade and foreign investment, as catalysts to rapid economic growth. So we're delighted to have this panel. I think without further ado, we're going to turn to Professor Easterly.
Thank you. Let me do a mic check that you can hear me in the back. I'm a soft-spoken guy from Ohio. So I'm going to talk to you today about the big picture on aid. And the big picture first has to recognize what I think is the fundamental cause of development. The fundamental cause of development is simply freedom, individual, political, economic freedom, where freedom is present, development happens. Where freedom is absent, development does not happen. And so from that point of view, which I think there's abundant theoretical and empirical evidence for, from that point of view, the real question about aid is, does aid support freedom or does it undermine freedom? And I'm going to give you, I'm not going to claim that aid always or everywhere undermines freedom, but I'm going to give you 2 cautionary examples about how I think in the current debate, there are 2 ways in which I've observed recently that aid has been undermining freedom. The first is going to be the idea of aid to support repressive regimes. And the second is going to be the idea of aid to prevent migration. So let me go take each of these in turn. Aid to repressive regimes, I think, is very common in the world today. I actually documented in it with empirical evidence that repressive regimes actually get more aid than free regimes. too. And the increase in aid has been larger for more repressive regimes than it has been for more free regimes over the last 10 or 15 years. So there is a sad way in which a lot of official government aid and NGO aid is going to repressive regimes. And let me make it very concrete. One country that I have written about and followed and been to is Ethiopia. There was a dictator named Meles Zenawi who was in power for a very long time in Ethiopia, who received lots and lots of aid from the US government, from the UK government, from the World Bank, from the European aid agencies. And Meles Zenawi was an oppressive ruler who was guilty of numerous human rights violations, some of them in the middle of foreign aid programs like forced resettlement in the context of a development program, shooting down peaceful demonstrators on the street. And then one example that is very close to my heart is a peaceful journalist and blogger who is a democratic activist named Eskinder Nega, was put in jail by Meles Zenawi in 2012 and sentenced to 28 years in jail for the crime of advocating for freedom in Ethiopia. And so it offends me personally at a very deep level that my taxpayer dollars are going to pay the security services that arrested Eskinder Nega. They're going to pay the salaries of the jailers that are watching over Eskinder Nega while he's in jail for 28 years. It's paying for the awful prison that is housing Eskinder Nega. I think that's an unacceptable use of aid to support an oppressive regime. And frankly, aid that supports repression is, if freedom is the key to development, then aid that supports the lack of freedom is not developing a country, it's undeveloping a country. So aid is undeveloping Ethiopia. Eskinder Nega got a lot of recognition from human rights activists and activists of free press around the world. He also got a lot of support from the Ethiopian diaspora that is here in Washington. And he was partly the focus of heroic campaigns by democracy activists in Ethiopia. And to give you, since some of this story could sound very dark, I want to give you one ray of light. This campaign was successful in freeing Eskinder Nega. I had the honor of meeting Eskinder Nega in person in my office a month ago in New York. So campaigning for freedom is not a hopeless cause. It can have some very happy moments of success. And it was very interesting to hear Eskinder Nega's perspective on aid to Ethiopia when I met him. The line that he said that stuck with me, that has echoed with me ever since, is he said to me, speaking as like what he thinks he was speaking for many Ethiopians, speaking to American taxpayers, we don't want you to do good for us against our consent. We don't want you to do what you think is good for us against our consent. And that for me is a very eloquent statement of the idea of freedom. Aid to a repressive regime is a non-consensual relationship that is undermining freedom. Let me now move to the second point. The idea, and this is probably has already surprised you that I would give this as an example of a violation of freedom. The idea of aid that is going to prevent migration. So this idea I actually wrote about in my book. Thank you, Jim, for publicizing the book so I don't have to. Available for a very low price on Amazon today. There's a chapter in there on both chapters in there, but both on Eskinder Nega and on migration. The idea of aid to prevent migration goes all the way back to aid to Republican China in the 1920s and 30s to try to prevent Chinese from immigrating to the U.S. in the context of what was called the Oriental Exclusion Act of 1924 that completely banned Japanese and Chinese immigration to the U.S. out of the idea that there was something very scary and threatening about Japanese and Chinese migrants. And that was used as justification for aid then. We hear it again today. There's now lots of talk, which is not new at all, about aid to what is called the Northern Triangle of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras in Central America to try to prevent the flood of Central American refugees coming to the U.S. So let me be clear about the way in which I think this is a violation of freedom. First of all, let me be very clear. I know this is not the majority view of U.S. voters, but as a free market economist, I believe in free trade in goods. I believe also in free trade in labor services. I believe in freedom of association. So free trade in labor services means that I want to have the right to hire, to work with me or over me or under me, anybody that I want anywhere in the world, not just American citizens, if they are willing to take the job that I offer to them. That's a voluntary transaction that is just like a lot of other voluntary transactions that we celebrate the benefits of in free markets. I give you a very homely personal example of that. I actually have a terrible, terrible record at running the Development Research Institute of finding good employees. I just seem to be really bad at doing interviews to find who are the good employees. So I'm not implicating any of you who I'm sure are all very good employees of wherever you're working, but to be honest, I've had some really terrible employees because I'm so bad at hiring people. But at one point, I lucked into a fantastic employee who made me incredibly productive working with her and in a very close working relationship with a woman named Marina. I don't want to give her full name to protect her privacy. She was a citizen of Russia. She had studied with me in the master's program at NYU and then came to work for me afterwards. And she just made me, she told me she was very happy in her job and really enjoyed the opportunity of doing that work. I benefited enormously from her contributions. But sadly, the severe restrictions on her visa meant that she could only work for me for a very limited amount of time, and then she was forced to return to Russia, very much against her will and very much against my will. This is something that we often forget when we talk about immigration restrictions, that these restrictions are not only restrictions on the freedom of migrants, they're restrictions on our freedoms as U.S. citizens to hire and interact with whom we want and to associate with whom we want. Freedom of travel, freedom of immigration is a freedom that allows us as U.S. citizens to have the right to find these mutually beneficial, positive sum, wonderfully beneficial relationships. So after Marina was forced to go back to Russia, I had more disastrous employees. My productivity went way down. I would have produced another book by now if Marina had stayed there, if she had not been forced to leave. But I didn't. So that's an attempt to take down the temperature on this heated immigration debate that we're having right now, to show you in a very homely way just how beneficial it can be when we all do voluntary transactions with each other as we celebrate in the tradition of free market economics. So what is the idea of aid to prevent migration? So if you think about it, is telling poor people that want to migrate to the U.S., which is actually a wonderfully beneficial development program. Probably the most effective development program of all time has been migration. One really great study by Land Pritchett and Michael Clemens found that 82% of Haitians who have ever escaped poverty have done so by moving to the U.S. Meanwhile, billions of dollars have been wasted on development aid to Haiti that has been largely ineffective at developing Haiti. So to tell poor people, we offer you, to say to them, we're going to take away your right to migrate, but we offer you instead a development program to develop you if you stay where you are. It's giving them something they don't want, taking something away they do want, and something we know from the track record is offering them something that doesn't work in exchange for something that does work, migration to a high productivity place. So, I respect very much the views of those who oppose free migration. I know it's very politically unrealistic to think that borders can be completely open, that they can be completely unrestricted. But I would argue that those of us who have this view that I do should make the case. We have the right to be democratic dissenters from the will of the majority and argue that there should be relatively less restrictions on migration instead of relatively more. I think also the idea that aid should be used to prevent migration is just an inherently offensive ideal to our ideal of freedom, even if you believe that migration should have some controls. We have to be realistic about what it is really doing. It is, again, offering poor people something they don't want, taking away something they do want. And that's just an inherently offensive idea of supposedly benevolent development aid. And frankly, I think the other way in which I think you may be surprised that I'm trying to link aid to the immigration debate, but I think aid is actually deeply implicated in the immigration debate. The other thing that aid has very unintentionally done is it's very common among aid advocates to say things like, we need aid to prevent terrorism. We need aid to fight terrorism. And when you sort of unpack that argument, what do you think it is really saying? It is implying that poor people are prone to terrorism, prone to be terrorists, unless they get this rescue package from the US of development aid that will prevent them from becoming terrorists. And then, of course, a lot of them are not, US citizens know that probably a lot of them are not getting enough development aid. So then the prediction is that they will become terrorists of that argument. That argument is completely empirically unfounded. First, of course, terrorism is very rare among any group. It's talking about one in an ocean of millions in any group or any income classification. And second, terrorism is actually much more associated with more middle income, higher educated, richer countries, such as Saudi Arabia being a very rich country that produces far more terrorists than all of Africa, for example. So aid has been very implicated in unintentionally creating very negative, fearful images of poor people that has then influenced this debate that we have this fear of migrants that is based on a distorted information set that is being conveyed by aid, because it is in the self-interest of NGOs and aid advocates, and I've been guilty of this myself, in trying to sell why development is important, why development aid is important, to kind of like, oh, we can reach a much larger audience and get much more money and more donations and more US taxpayer funding if we sell aid as an answer to terrorism, not thinking about the implications that this is implying that poor people are prone to terrorism. So the unintentional effect is that we convey these negative, fearful images. I've seen this personally in a video that really shocked me by the NGO Save the Children. They put out a fundraising video that portrayed a very scary picture of a Syrian gunman with a rifle pointed at a child. What was strange about the picture was actually an English child that the gunman was pointing the gun at. And the picture had been totally staged. They had just put on set, hired an actor to portray a gunman pointing a gun, portray a fictional Syrian gunman pointing a gun at an English child. I thought that would be highly effective at raising money from the UK public to portray Syrian gunmen threatening English children. And it was highly effective at raising money for Save the Children. But it also spread the image of, Syrian refugees are all gunmen pointing guns at European and American children. And that's this very negative consequence. So, how does this contrast with the free market perspective? The free market perspective, there's historians of economic thought credit Adam Smith with inventing the idea of analytical equality of all individuals. We think of individuals not as defined by some innate characteristic of proneness to violence or something like that of some group that they belong to. We define individuals as analytically equal who are responding to incentives and institutions. And, and poor people who live in oppressive societies with bad institutions have bad outcomes. But you take those same individuals and put them in a society with good institutions and incentives, and they flourish, of which the Haitian example earlier was a precise example of. And that to me is the core free market perspective on how we think about groups and nations and individuals, that we think of individuals as being primordially equal and not defined by the group or nation or race or ethnic group that they belong to, and responding to institutions and incentives. And that, to me, is the free market argument for equality that would advocate, much more humanity and tolerance and sympathetic thinking towards those who want to flee from oppressive societies and come to a free society. It's precisely those who love freedom who want to make that move. In fact, I mentioned earlier the Ethiopian diaspora played a big role in the freeing of Iskender Nega. They were precisely a group of individuals who were able to free the oppression in Ethiopia because they love freedom and can come to the U.S. Many of them, a large community of them here in Washington, and then spread freedom back to Ethiopia and achieve this partial success of the freeing of political prisoners, including Iskender Nega, and some political liberalization that is going on now. So there are ways in which migration can be a very positive sum gain, in which all sides gain from this beneficial transaction. Now, I know that there are very good arguments on the other side of that debate, and I'm not going to try to project any kind of claim. I think the debate has been poisoned by those who try to project some claim to moral superiority if they happen to hold one side or the other. I'm not claiming that. I don't feel morally superior to those who oppose immigration. I may be completely wrong. I may be completely misthinking it. I may be misguided. They may be right. We're in a democratic society where we should be having a civil conversation about this and not shouting insults at each other. But what I do believe is that, the business of development is mainly the business of freedom. And you cannot judge aid in isolation from other U.S. government policies. You cannot judge aid in isolation from the whole agenda of promoting freedom everywhere in the world. Every nation, every group, every individual everywhere in the world deserves freedom. And the business of aid should be only about promoting freedom. It should not be the opposite of by supporting repressive regimes that deny freedom to their own citizens. It should not be in the more subtle context of taking away the freedom to migrate in returns for coercive development programs that they don't want, that don't work. I believe that today in the 21st century, we need really to move beyond the whole aid debate and go embrace wholeheartedly the debate that the cause of development is the cause of spreading human freedom worldwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next up is Paul Applegarth.
I guess I'll stand up. Okay. I have a tendency to move around if I'm standing, so it's going to drive the audio people crazy. But generally, I don't need a mic. It's a pleasure to be here. And before I begin, I want to really recognize the work of Heritage, initially by Brett Schaefer, but picked up by Jim on the Index of Economic Freedom and some of the other measures of what good policies count. I think a long time, many years ago, they were the ones who recognized that good policies help drive human satisfaction and human growth and human betterment. And economic freedom is key to that. You have the World Bank doing some other measures important. You have some other NGOs or think tanks doing things, whether it's transparency, but international. Heritage really blazed the trail with the economic freedom indicator, both the idea behind measuring policy and then the quality of the effort and the amount of effort to do it right. So thank you. A couple of basic messages today. One, I think one of the good things is that making foreign aid more effective is not a partisan issue. You'll find as many people on the left as are on the right who want foreign aid to be effective, and by that I mean to benefit its recipients and also serve the U.S. interest. The obstacles to making it more effective are more institutional, whether it's congressional committees and committee chairs who are interested in turf, inertia bureaucrats who really basically need leadership to be led in a certain direction. Otherwise, they'd rather keep doing what they're doing because they know how to do it. Some people around the Beltway who have a strong economic interest in the perpetuation of the status quo. But that is not a partisan issue. And I think there are a lot of opportunities to reach out to others and other even think tanks in Washington to work collaboratively to make some change. When we're talking, when we're talking about, at least what I'm talking about, recognize there are different types. And I mean, there's traditional disaster relief, which people frequently forget about, which is there's an earthquake or tsunami, and USAID is premier in all the world in intervening in those situations. That is foreign aid as well. That's not what we're talking about today. There's straight humanitarian relief, which comes out of really a desire to really help very poor people, charitable institutions. But again, that's not so much what I'm talking about. There's the reward your friends foreign aid. Some people do some things for us, other countries, we basically call it different things, whether it's military security assistance or it's just other kinds of programs. We recognize what we're doing, what they're doing, and we want to somehow or other have that recognized in the country. And then there's long-term development assistance, which is really trying to make the lives of poor people better, not by necessarily giving them money, but by creating an opportunity for them to help themselves, either by establishing good governance in the countries, a rule of law, creating economic freedoms, freedom of the press, other things by which they and their society that creates an environment of opportunity in which they can better themselves and we can help them along the way. But the ultimate responsibility is there. And Heritage is right in arguing that good governance and is the key. A democratic government is a key to long-term development. I also think we sometimes forget about that. We're also talking about local ownership. We cannot make a country development. We cannot derive it. It's got to be owned in the country. And the other thing is you really have to look at the results and the outcomes. And it seems to me the three core lessons, which of long-term, of 40 years at a time, foreign assistance, which MCC was built on, were those three lessons. Policies matter, results matter, the countries must do it. And we, from the first days when President Bush 43 said we want to help countries to help themselves, and Colin Powell and Condi Rice were involved, and in Leaders on the Hill, that was the key of philosophy. And that's a quite focused and somewhat different, and if you, a lot of the other programs we're doing. We are providing humanitarian assistance, whether or not the countries, still like them to see it to be effective or not, but it's going to a lot of folks who need it in the countries, whether or not the country governments themselves care about it very much. Similarly with some of the other things, but real long-term development is built on those principles of good governance environment, good policy, and again, doing things to get results. Now, there have been a lot of proposals around how to make foreign assistance better. A lot of them involve reorganization and other things. And I'm not going to go through those again. You're familiar with all the arguments. So I'm actually going to talk about a couple things that could be done that don't require legislation and could be done right now if the institutions themselves would do it, and if the administration gets behind it. And the one that did require legislation was MCC's ability to do regional compacts. I think we have to. I actually advocated this. I did a piece with the Center for Global Development and the Center for American Progress about how this could work. But we'll have to see at the end of the day how it's actually implemented and done. But that's done. But what doesn't really require legislation is proactively working with other donors. If you read a lot of the testimony and a lot of the speeches by others, they will talk about working with partners and talking about other donors. But if you read, it always sounds like what they're trying to do is to get them on board to fund U.S. programs and U.S. initiatives. And this is because the U.S. has for a long time the big gorilla in the room, and it didn't have to listen to anybody else. And if it wanted to go in and do it, it did it, and other people might or might not. But the reality is, partly because of size, partly because of distance, a number of other donors have actually got some quite innovative programs going on. And so what I'm talking about working with other donors, I'm talking about finding out what they've done and listening to them and trying to figure out how we might learn from them. I think particularly some things have been done in the development of infrastructure in Africa and elsewhere, and the facilitation of private sector investment. There's a lot of quite innovative techniques that were done a decade ago by FMO, which is the Development Finance Agency in the Netherlands, or British DFID, or a number of the European governments. Those lessons are still not incorporated in our development work and in our aid programs. And yet, if you once you recognize that, I think Bill said, ODA is no longer the major flow to these countries, and that the major flow to the countries is both either direct foreign investment or repatriation of capital by people who are in the countries, doing the kind of things that these other institutions have done to really help facilitate that and look at the creative instruments to make that happen is important. So I would say listen to them, and more than listen to them. I think AID has, and Andrew Nachios is very good about this, with the leaders of those agencies, but at MCC, we actually had somebody designated within MCC to work with those agencies all the time to get their ideas and make sure we were listening to them, understood what was going on. And it's an organizational, operational commitment. In our case, a couple of people was a much larger percentage of staff. They would be at AID, but it was at a senior level. And you could get a lot of ideas, and that gave us a basis for really talking and working with those donors, and who are also working in the countries to try to do something new and innovative, and rather than simply try to do a big funding program. And so I would encourage AID and other agencies that are working in the countries to actually designate somebody at a senior level in the organization to work with those agencies and to feed their ideas in. Personally, I think MCC should return to doing smaller compacts, at least for the first compact. I think there was a shift after a couple of years fell into the trap of believing that U.S. government dollars were the solution. We had to have a lot of U.S. government dollars going into the program or into a country to make a developmental impact. And I think in some ways the fundamental lesson of the creation of MCC, which is that policies matter and good governance matter, got lost because those really attract other capital. And what you need to have a huge compacts, which can be quite good, are very complex. They can take 3, 4, 5 years to get formulated and put in place, and then start dispersing. Well, that works potentially for the World Bank, but we're talking about policy change and governance, and you have to do something within the political life of the political leaders in the countries. They have to see the results on the ground before the next election, or within a couple of elections. If you wait 5 years, if their successor gets all the benefits, you lose a lot of the incentive of an MCC compact in promoting and rewarding governance reform. So I would hope MCC would look quite seriously at, for initial compacts at least, doing quicker, smaller, faster, if you like. It's a little bit redundant. But in terms of getting the countries fully engaged once they've been named, helping them develop the compact, and beginning to get the project visible on the ground to the beneficiaries. A lot of expectations are high when an MCC compact is for countries first named, and then when its compact is signed. But if nothing happens for 3 years, it really loses its ability to influence policy. Second compacts, if they have them, can be larger. You've got more time to build it. You can begin thinking about it if a country's on track, and you have the time to develop it. Even the course of the first compact, to be thinking about it. But get the first rewards, the first compacts done with the country, so that you can reward those leaders who stepped up and pushed for good governance during their terms of office. And a lot of talk about public-private partnerships these days. I've talked about it at CSIS a couple of months ago. But the reality, and I think they're interesting, but they are not a panacea. They are, having done one, it's actually quite successful, they are very hard to do well. So if you go, the objectives, if it's a really public-private partnership, the parties have different interests, but you can find a way to work together. But sorting through those interests and introducing the checks and balances and mutual rewards is difficult, and operation begins to be difficult. So it is not a quick rubber stamp solution. But I certainly encourage that. It's one way to get greater influence on things like outcomes and results and effectiveness built into the system and operation. But an easier solution is actually to get more private sector people, and I mean that by private sector broadly defined, non-government people, in the governance of the programs. MCC was fortunate. 4 of the directors are not part of the administration. They're from outside. So we're private sector, NGOs, former political leaders. That different perspective, different type of thinking is very helpful. A public-private partnership I did in sub-Saharan Africa also had private sector members, not only on the governing board, but on the investment committee and on the original committee screening projects. And they had quite different perspectives than the other individuals who were there. So find ways to try to incorporate different views and different perspectives into the decision-making process to the extent that you can. Sometimes there'll be legal constraints on that, but other cases it might have to be advisory rather than actually voting. Voting really helps. But the point is, if you really want to incorporate results, detailed implementation plans focus on outcomes, it is better to get people who are awarded in their careers for focusing on that, and that not necessarily is traditional people who come up through the government. And finally, I think there's a bunch of other things I could say, and I personally think, as I'm coming back to the question of repatriation capital and foreign investment, there could be a lot more work done on development of capital markets in countries. This is a shameless plug and self-promotion of a paper I did about probably 8 or 9 years ago about how to promote capital market development. We're not talking about building stock exchanges, okay? We're talking about institutional investors in the countries, domestic pension funds. We're talking about research analysts, all the accoutrements that come with a functioning capital market. You can provide support for that with a decent securities law, with promoting good governance and the rule of law. That's how your capital begins to flow. You liquefy it, you get people, and you get the people who are domestically, who probably know best what works best in their country, no matter how much time we as an outsider might know or do. They're the ones that are can do the allocation if they have the ability of capital to their benefit and the country's benefit if the institutions are there to help support them. I think that's enough. Thank you very much.
And now Jose Cardenas.
Jim, I think I'll, if it's okay, I'll do it from the panel. I'm nice and comfortable here. As Jim was introducing distinguished panelists, I heard MIT, Harvard, Yale, and then there's me. What I thought I would do was bring a perspective to this discussion, less as one of a development practitioner and more as a practitioner of foreign policy, and somebody who, in my experience, has seen up close the important symbiotic relationship of the 3 Ds in carrying out U.S. foreign policy: defense, diplomacy, and development. So, but when we talk about the development component, again, I'll associate myself with the remarks that Jim made about the difficult state of our foreign assistance bureaucracy and its implementation. And I was struck by a quote in the paper prepared by Brett Schaefer and Jim about reforming foreign assistance, which I highly recommend. I think it's one of the best articulations of a new vision in a practical sense, very, very practical recommendations. The quote is, "No objective supporter of foreign aid can be satisfied with the existing program. Actually, a multiplicity of programs Bureaucratically fragmented, awkward, and slow, its administration is diffused over a haphazard and irrational structure covering at least 4 departments and several other agencies. The program is based on a series of legislative measures and administrative procedures conceived at different times and for different purposes, many of them now obsolete, inconsistent, unduly rigid, and thus unsuited for our present needs and purposes. Its weaknesses have begun to undermine confidence in our effort both here and abroad. You know who said that? John F. Kennedy in 1961. And in most ways, we are still facing the same challenges. And think about it, folks. This was an era where our foreign assistance probably had its strongest raison d'etre, and that was the Cold War, in our efforts to contest the spread of communism in the developing world. But to criticize this situation is not to recommend throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It is to recognize that the imperative of a complete refocusing and reorganization of our foreign assistance apparatus to meet the challenges of the 21st century. So when I say that the 3 Ds, the defense, diplomacy, and development, I'll use some examples. For example, when during the administration of George W. Bush, during the height of the war on terror, we found out the hard way that we didn't have all of our capacities in full gear in Iraq and Afghanistan. Our men and women in uniform are the best at what they do in the world, by far. And that is blowing up things and killing bad people. But you need a civilian capacity, as we found out in Iraq and Afghanistan. You need a civilian capacity between kinetic force and diplomacy to get into these unstabilized areas and implement stabilization and post-conflict programs. Those come from our foreign assistance pots of money, if you will. So we are always going to need something between kinetic force and diplomacy. I know, as somebody who once worked in a congressional office, that there are few things more unpopular with the folks back home than foreign aid. But in many ways, it's based on outdated concepts. I can hear them now. People complaining about foreign kleptocrats pocketing U.S. assistance and putting it in Swiss bank accounts. Well, we've adapted over the years. So it's we have very few direct transfers to governments abroad. It is mostly working directly with folks on the ground through contractors or through our mission in foreign capitals. But still, that still necessitates what we've been talking about, a new approach to the way that foreign assistance is doled out. And it's important to define what exactly it is we're talking about, because we do have various programs that all fall under the rubric of foreign assistance. We have humanitarian and health assistance. We have development assistance, which is the part that's focused on long-term development, as my distinguished colleagues have talked about. We have political assistance, and we have military and security assistance. So from my perspective, I don't think we need to tinker much with humanitarian and health assistance. We do that very well. We are a country that is founded on Judeo-Christian values. From the wealthy, the fortunate, we have a responsibility to help those less fortunate. I don't think that humanitarian and health assistance is something that that, that most Americans would consider zeroing out, if you will. Military and security assistance, it's the same thing. I think that mostly conducted by the Defense Department, it is a crucial element of our foreign policy for obvious reasons. Where I see the most opportunity for refinement is in long-term development assistance and political assistance. I think that what we need to see is new concepts in the implementation of those two lines of assistance. And when we think about what those concepts should be, I think that there are a few buzzwords. I think that we need to be realistic. We cannot be all things to all people. We cannot spread ourselves so thin that we dilute the impact of our assistance. We need to focus on a few things that we do well and do them well. I think we have to have a more flexible system. Right now, our assistance is always written through Congress, directing how much, where, when is going to be spent. We need more flexibility in our assistance to, for example, scale up quickly in response to national emergency, in response to international emergencies. As I remember when I was in the Bush administration, when the Russians invaded the country of Georgia, all of a sudden everyone was running around trying to find money to send to Georgia that would help the people there. It wasn't military assistance. It was a gesture by the United States to support the Georgian people at a time when the Russians were invading and obviously bullying the Georgian people. We have to get back to a very clear definition in our development and in our political assistance to what is in the self-interest of the United States of America. I, for one, believe that our foreign assistance in those two categories should be directly aligned with whatever administration is in power with their national security strategy. Every president, every administration develops a national security strategy that comes out of the National Security Council that defines what mobilizes and what is important, what are the critical needs of our national security policy. We need to align those aspects of our overseas assistance with that national security strategy. And for example, what would we mean by that? I think that in a review of what our interests are abroad, we have to identify priorities. I would suggest one priority: countries that are facing a radical Islamist insurgency. Those are countries that we ought to pay special attention to. Countries on the periphery of Russia. These are countries that Vladimir Putin is openly threatening and intimidating. Those are people that look to the United States. We spent 40 years of the Cold War in solidarity with these countries of Central Europe. And now I would suggest it is definitely in the national interest of the United States to continue to support them in their efforts to protect their sovereignty. And we have issues even closer to home. We have breakdowns of democracy going on right now in Venezuela and Nicaragua. We have lack of democracy in Cuba. These are also situations close to home that should concern U.S. policymakers, who should have the flexibility in our assistance to develop policies that promote U.S. interests in these specific situations. So those are the guidelines, and for measuring the effectiveness of our assistance, I think we have to, I commend Dr. Easterly for his emphasis on freedom. We have to, you know, we have, in order to justify programs, the system gets very bogged down in measurements and evaluations of specific programs, in outputs, inputs and outputs. Well, we have to start thinking about more about outcomes than outputs. If a country is moving in a broad-based way to more freedom, more open society, more productive economies, and less corruption, then, and we have metrics for that. Heritage has their economic report. Transparency International has anti-corruption reports. The World Bank has ease of doing business reports. Let's put all those together and let's figure out who's going in the right direction. Which countries are exhibiting the political will to do the right thing for their people, and let's support them. That is another component. We have our own self-interest, our own national security imperatives. We have an interest, a national interest in helping those countries that are making the tough decisions to improve the lot of their people. And finally, as has been alluded to, the 500-pound gorilla in any reassessment and reorganization of our foreign assistance is the U.S. Congress. They are embedded in the money, the levels of funding, the direction of our foreign assistance. In many ways, the executive branch is absolutely paralyzed in the conduct of our implementation of foreign assistance to Congress. And again, this is not to bash Congress on this, because Congress is also facing the people back home. What are you doing with our foreign aid? Well, I'll tell you, they get involved. And they get involved to a degree that they take almost all the power away from the executive branch on the issue of foreign aid. So any effort to reorganize and make our assistance more efficient, more flexible, and more delivering results for U.S. national interests, Congress has to be at the table. And obviously that's easier said than done. But it is simply a reality of the way that it's all built. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jim.
Thanks so much, Jose. And before we go to the audience, does anyone on the panel have a response to anything that's been said so far that you'd like to address? Okay, so we'll go to questions. And I think, I don't know if Ambassador Miller is ready with a question or not. Okay, I did want to make sure my boss got the first chance. Our editor-in-chief of our Index of Economic Freedom, and we appreciate the kind words about our index. Thanks very much. It is our roadmap to development by the Heritage Foundation. So please, questions, and please do keep to a form of question and not a statement. Thank you. No, this right here. Yeah. Please state your name for affiliation. Yeah.
Dave Onspach, just taxpaying American citizen, that's affiliation. I guess the question, a lot of foreign aid we give to Israel, even though it's considered a prosperous and wealthy country, and I know 50 years ago, a major political leader was murdered because of that, Robert F. Kennedy, because of his support for this kind of aid to Israel. So I'm trying to think, do most of you continue to support aid to Israel, number one, and number two, arms sales to countries like Saudi Arabia with an authoritarian record, at least as repressive as China? Do most of you continue to support aid to Israel, even though it's a quite prosperous country, compared, I'm saying compared to poor countries, and you think that those, you think both of these programs should be reformed?
Okay, thanks for that question. Who would like to take that? Maybe.
Thank you.
Maybe who? Yes. Yes. Yeah, but let's take a couple more, and then we'll have a round. So please, Gordon.
Gordon Johnson. I came to work in Washington to work in the Marshall Plan, and
Not many people can say that.
Came,
Did a good job.
came back to work on privatization.
You did the last
One of the
successful
answers
aid program.
to development when state-owned enterprises were seen as part of the problem. But the first country we went to work in was Honduras. And the consultant that we sent down after I'd explained privatization and why that's going to be great for the country, and he said, Gordon, the first thing you have to do is convince the 20 families that run the country not to be greedy this time. And this, we've heard a lot about Ethiopia, need for freedom, economic freedom, all the needs we have, but I haven't heard anything specifically so far today that would give me some clues. What are we going to do different, specifically, rather than just generalities about more of this and more of that? But I don't get the feel. Who's going to do it? How? Is the private sector going to do it? Are we going to sit back and wait for the countries? What are we going to do about Venezuela? We talked about Venezuela, Cuba, these countries where change is needed. But how do you bring about change?
Okay, let's have one more, and then we'll have responses. Back here, please. Yeah.
Thank you. Jessica Trisco-Darden. I'm assistant professor at American University and the Jean Kirkpatrick Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you all for having this conversation here today. My question to you is what role U.S. foreign aid should play when we have a contraction of freedoms? So, for example, recently the Philippines said that they were not going to negotiate an additional MCC compact. They've also refused EU aid because of political conditionality and rule of law conditionality. What role can U.S. foreign assistance play in that context of kind of contracting rule of law and civil and political freedoms?
Thanks. Excellent question. So who'd like to take a crack at these? I'll start with the professor, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, so let me say one thing in reaction to my distinguished colleague, Jose Cardenas. I think in our soft diplomatic way, you and I are presenting the opposite viewpoints on the utility of selling development as a way to fight terrorism. And you are suggesting there is a complementarity between defense, development, and diplomacy, which was an idea very popular in both the Bush and Obama administrations. Whereas I'm trying to argue the opposite. I really think there is no complementarity, that there are really opposite causes. I think it is misdiagnosing the problem of terror. The terrorism is not caused by poverty, it's caused by evil people and evil ideologies. And poor people are not innately prone to terrorism. It's that kind of image that has been unintentionally conveyed by the idea of development as a solution to terrorism, as I try to argue, done great damage in our image of poor people that has affected the immigration debate. And that's these are not generalities. These are real life ideas that have can have very negative consequences. And so that I respect very much your opinion and your justification for development. I'm frankly a minority dissenter on this issue, but I'm offering you that dissent for your consideration. On the other questions, aid to Saudi Arabia, again, is another case of suppressing a regime that's not only extremely repressive at home, but perpetrating war crimes in Yemen and selling them arms and giving them aid. It's just, again, it's the opposite of freedom. It's supporting the denial of freedom to Saudi citizens, to the citizens of Yemen that are the victims of the Saudi military campaign. you know, when you say, what should we do? And, you know, why are you offering these lofty generalities? Well, I think, you know, the ideals of freedom and liberty are not empty generalities. I think they have been very powerful ideas in human history and are still very powerful today. I think that ideal of democratic political freedom was not an idea, an empty generality to Iskandar Nega when he was in jail, and the campaign of Ethiopian activists to reverse that oppression is not based on empty generalities. It's based on the noble ideals that have made our own accomplishments in the United States the society that we are today. So, you know, I don't apologize for offering you these lofty generalities. They are the ideals that are the lifeblood of development and human well-being and human flourishing. After that, I have nothing to say.
On the issue of Middle East, obviously, the geopolitical situation necessitates, in the eyes of successive U.S. policymakers, some very, very difficult trade-offs. Nobody would defend in any way the certain conditions that the Saudi people are forced to live under. We are, as we have been since the end of World War II, our economic prosperity has almost been held hostage to the oil-producing countries. And that necessitates, again, some hard decisions about how U.S. policy should be conducted in that area of the world. It's decisions that have been supported by both Republicans and Democrats in the whole post-war period. And it has cost us. It has cost the United States in its image in many ways, leveled it open to charges of hypocrisy. I would recommend reading Elliot Abrams' latest book, where he tackles some of these issues. How do you promote human rights at the same time that you are conducting normal relations with a government like Saudi Arabia? These are problems that have taxed U.S. policymakers for 50 years. And if somebody comes up with all the answers, I hope they would write a book so we can all learn. I think that on the issue of Honduras, absolutely. The elites like it the way it is, and it's very hard to break through. I think that development is not a mystery. We know what works. It's rule of law. It's freedom. It is getting regulations and government restrictions off the backs of private citizens to open up opportunity and free individual initiative. And the challenge, once again, is most of these societies of these types are under the thumb of elites that like it the way it is because they benefit the most from it. Again, it is a problem that has vexed U.S. policymakers for 50, 60 years. And we keep attempting to convince or push, maybe we need to be stronger. Maybe we need to be more uncompromising with these types of leaders that are denying opportunities to their fellow citizens, and use more of our leverage as the United States of America to force change in their behavior. But it comes down to political will, ladies and gentlemen. It comes down to strong visionary leadership in these countries. And unfortunately, people with those visions and those strengths only come once every few generations. And so it's a tough nut to crack. On the issue of countries where we see contractions of freedom, our aid apparatus has the flexibility and the capacity to also counter those situations, whereby we can shift. It's not, again, it comes down to our system is not flexible enough, but we have the capacity, we have the capability to shift assistance to civil society groups that will attempt to hold their government accountable. And so whether it's through the National Endowment for Democracy and its affiliated organizations, through other contracting organizations that have experience, we also have what are called cross-border programs. This is into countries where we don't have a mission. In fact, we don't have a good enough relationship with the host government to have an aid mission in the embassy, even if we have an embassy in a country. But we have systems whereby, for example, in Iran, where U.S. assistance makes its way into Iran, attempting to bolster civil society in those countries against governments that are violating their rights. So we have the capacity. It is having the will to and the will to redirect more resources into those capacities and have more flexibility to scale them up quicker.
And Paul.
Didn't want to be in the middle or in the part of that debate, but I'm stuck in the middle anyway. But I think your question goes back to there are lots of types of foreign assistance, and a lot of the flows you're talking about to Saudi Arabia and Israel do not fall into what I'm talking about, development assistance. That's the reward your friends type aid. Some of it's military assistance. I do think that there are certain programs in the State Department involve large amounts of money to some very poor countries, and I did back forever years ago. But where's this money going? And if you're going to write this kind of check, what are you trying to achieve, and what are the results? And where are the targeted programs, rather than just have it flow into some tribal areas? Okay, why can't we establish some disciplines about objectives and outcomes and how you're going to use the money? If the money's actually available, let's try to get some real impact for it other than simply reward the country. Frankly, I never got a really satisfactory answer to that. But I do think greater look at the effectiveness of these programs and what these don't confuse them, I call them development programs. But even the Reward Your Friends program is taking a greater look at their impact and what are you trying to achieve and whether the money will actually achieve that. It would be a good discipline to have.
Great. That might be a great segue. I'd like to give a chance for Ambassador Miller, also Brett Schaefer, to weigh in before we go to any further questions. And both of them have worked either at the UN or on UN issues for a long time.
Before we do that, let me just finish on Honduras.
Yeah.
Okay. A lot of that, again, because it's nitty-gritty, we at MCC, we evaluated how the compact was chosen. How did they pick their priority? And if it was written by a couple people in the government, then it didn't pass our test. We basically two tests. What are you trying to achieve, and will it work? And then secondly, how did you pick it? And you ended up with a program which was much more targeted to rural areas with controls on flows. And so it was much more difficult for the elites to benefit from it. Okay, I mean that's not grand development policy, but that actually seemed to have an impact. I don't know the final results of that compact, but the point is trying to make sure that the people deciding, that are deciding what the benefit ought to be, are the ones making the decision, and you put what the goals of the compact are on the web so they can see it, and the web is available no matter how poor the country is generally to people, and how you progress against the results. that kind of transparency acts as some discipline about keeping the elites out. There's one country, I remain nameless, where they were named, and the USAID head of mission actually wrote their compact proposal. The head of AID almost fired the guy on the spot and said, "You don't get it." And recall. And the point is, you really have to push out the decision making to the country and make sure they really understand it. And that helps control the influence of the elites. Is it perfect?
The Millennium Challenge program worked. You were really in the answering my question when you were set up, in the sense that with not working in these bad places, let's pick good places and
Right.
we'll work there. Is that working?
I believe the general assessments are, yes, it is working. I'll defer to, in cases where it didn't work, one of the disciplines, you stop the compact.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about the flexibility in the programs. Well, the flexibility that AID frequently doesn't have is to stop. All right, that's the greatest flexibility. Stop. And it's a question of, in the Philippines, they may have said they're not going to have a second compact. The real issue is whether they ought to stop the first compact. Okay, they may be, not having the second is, there may nobody negotiate on the other side of the table because MCC decided they're not going to go ahead. So that is a fairly effective degree of flexibility. And you have to be tough. I happen to think having non-governmental people in the decision-making at the board level and elsewhere to enforce those disciplines is quite helpful, and I would recommend that.
I just want to add to Paul Applegarth's comments is that one of the points raised in the Heritage paper is whether to adopt those principles from the MCC organization, and the entire raison d'etre of the organization was to demand from the recipient certain levels of commitments that are measurable and are verifiable, and then you begin to negotiate an assistance contract with that country. So it is definitely premised on a two-way street for acceptable, beneficial activity and conduct on behalf of the host government for development in the answer to our providing that assistance. Now, the big question is whether to take those principles and adapt them to the whole range of U.S. development assistance. That's the point in the paper.
Great. Ambassador Miller.
Yeah, thank you very much for the discussion. I just have one comment and then a specific question for Mr. Applegarth. The comment would be that it's always been a very difficult conceptual issue for me to get beyond the idea that if freedom is the ultimate goal of what we're trying to achieve with aid programs, and economic freedom, as we study it at the Heritage Foundation, is in large measure revolving around the idea of the absence of government in the lives of people, that it's very difficult to imagine or conceive of how government operating, the government of the United States, through a subsidy program, which is what we do with aid flows, and often working through governments in foreign countries, is somehow promoting this freedom of individuals inside those countries. I just think that's a difficult problem to overcome in many cases. But the specific question I wanted to ask is a little bit more positive than that. Again, you all seem to agree with Dr. Easterly that freedom is the main goal here. And in the MCC process, much of the progress towards freedom seems to occur in the development of the compact, or indeed in the process of a country making itself eligible for a compact. So would it be fair to say that the major benefits are being achieved before the money flows rather than as a result of the money flowing?
One more answer, you first. if you want to know whether MCC is successful, go to the website, look, all the compacts and the results of their energy are there. You can judge for yourself in aggregate. Okay? Well, first, I'm a little puzzled by your comment because you measure economic freedom. Now, the things you measure are government policies at the end of the day, I think, with the index. And so the government has a role in creating an environment of economic freedom. I would probably define development slightly different than the bill. Freedom is part of it, but to me, it's creating the opportunity for people to help themselves and an environment, and inherent, I think, in a capitalist free market system is that kind of freedom. I'm sorry, come back to, restate your question, because
the question is, does the benefit of an MCC program actually primarily occur before the money flows as a result of the actions the government takes to become eligible?
It's a marathon, not a sprint development. And I think one of the things about MCC, it wants to see performance in terms of policies being implemented before it names a country as a compact. And so and if a country deviates from that, it can stop. It's different than a lot of foreign aid models where a country promises to do something, doesn't do it, and the aid program can't be stopped because of a variety of reasons. So the fundamental model is different. But there are a lot of policies still need to be improved in all countries, no matter what their level is. What we certainly saw is the bar, and MCC measures whether it passes its indicators by how you're doing relative to your peer group of the same income, per capita income countries. That bar, at least for the first several years, rose. World Bank used to talk about the MCC effect on policy. You could see countries passing, changing policies in order to qualify for MCC. And I give a lot of anecdotes of presidents of countries told me the things they were doing and did. So I think being static, a country that might have qualified at one point would not continue to qualify if it didn't continue to reform. The point, if you have the institutional things happening, you begin to get the capital flows. There are a lot of reasons and incentives to keep going. So it's not a static thing. And if they slip, if they don't stay static, they'll fall below the bar because everybody else is raising their bar. So it certainly helps to have the policy guidelines and the indicators out there as a start, but it's not the end of the day.
So we're starting to run a little short on time. I know Professor Easterly has a special guest he'd like to take note of and maybe allow a comment.
I didn't realize this. I didn't see him come in, but Eskinder Nega is with us. Eskinder, do you want to say something?
Thank you, Professor. I have a brief comment to make. I know that the moderator had said that we shouldn't make a comment, but
please do make a comment.
And I have, I think, one or two questions. As far as my comment is concerned, I would like to thank you as someone who has come from the front line in the battle between democracy, freedom, and tyranny. I would like to thank you for being the voice of those of us who are waging the good fight. And that fight is the fight for democracy, Professor. And I speak not only on my behalf or those of us who are fighting for freedom in Ethiopia, but also in the name of all those who are fighting for freedom throughout the world.
Thank you. You've sacrificed a lot more than anyone else in this room. So
thank you.
You're the one to be congratulated.
Thank you. And like you said, the ideals of freedom are not meaningless. They mean as much, though we are poor, they mean as much as they do here. They mean as much in Africa, in poor countries, as they mean here in the rich, advanced countries. Whether poor and backward, or whether rich and advanced, freedom has the same meaning, and that should be stressed. And having said that, I would like to ask a question to all three of you, whether freedom should not be considered as a national security component in U.S. foreign policy. I mean, where you have freedom, you don't have terrorism. therefore effectively promoting freedom then becomes a national security asset to the U.S. And this is one of my questions. And the second question is, the most successful foreign aid package in world history, I think, is the Marshall Plan. That was, that came after the Second World War, and a large component in this foreign aid package was the promotion of democracy and freedom. So, in light of this record, shouldn't the promotion of freedom be pursued even more in this age, when there's terrorism throughout the world?
Yes.
I don't know if this question is clear or not. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, you answered your own question far more eloquently than I could.
I think that it's also a wonderful reminder that at the other end of our programs are stories of individuals, courageous individuals that have visions for their country that are based on freedom and respect for human rights, and that we as a country are fortunate enough to be able to help them. And we should never forget about that. And thank you for your courage and your great story. And again, one of the reasons behind our foreign assistance is, again, to provide the sustenance by which brave individuals and individuals that seek the betterment of their own peoples. And we shouldn't ever forget that it's about these personal stories.
Great, thank you.
First, I believe it should be, and I also believe it frequently is, the promotion of freedom. It's not articulated in the same way in all the cases, but I mean, President Bush, 43, in his second inaugural address, discusses the freedom agenda as a key element of his foreign policy. If you haven't ever taken a look at it, you ought to take a look at it. But you see things in the Obama administration development policy elsewhere. I think this is, and it's sometimes expressed different ways, but the rights and the importance of the individual and preserving the freedoms of the individual, I think, is an underlying point of U.S. policy and should be.
Thank you. We're out of town now, except for final comments from our three panelists, so if you have any, or if you're all talked out.
I would rather give my final remarks over to Iskender if you want to say anything more.
Yeah, just one more thought, and that's something I've said over and over again whenever I have the opportunity, and that is, those who are free have an obligation, have a moral obligation, not a legal obligation, to help those of us who are not free. And this should be, reflected in the development aid policies that you have. Thank you.
Anything from Paul or Jose?
Just I appreciate the opportunity to come. Thanks to Heritage, and thanks for your continuing work in this area. Actually, I think it's important to broaden not only the index of economic freedom, but the other work that you're doing. And this paper is much broader in scope than some of the earlier things you did, and I think that's encouraging. So, thank you.
Thank you for that. And Jose?
No, just thank you, Jim, and thank you to my distinguished co-panelists. I thought it was a very excellent discussion. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you.
Indeed, it has been a rich and diverse conversation, and we've covered a vast amount of policy territory, which really defies a neat summing up. And so, but I would just end with 2 points. We look forward to proposals from the Trump administration to reform foreign aid, and we stress the importance of congressional involvement and action. So thanks. Please join me in thanking our panel.